Shalom Havarim, James Trim here. Today I want to talk to you about the Peshitta Syriac Aramaic version of the New Testament. We made a video recently about the Old Syriac Aramaic version of the four Gospels. And unfortunately, we only have the four Gospels in the Old Syriac version. The rest of the Old Syriac has not survived, at least not directly. But as we pointed out or made the case for in our last video, the Peshitta is really a revision of the Old Syriac. So we're going to talk today about the Peshitta. Before I get going, I need to remind everybody to please donate to support this work and these videos. And you can do that by clicking on the donation link in the video description down below. You can also do that by sending donations by PayPal to donations@wnae.org. That's donations@wnae.org. Also, don't forget to like this video. Please subscribe to our channel. Click that notification bell so you'll get notifications when new videos come out. Let us know what you think of our videos in the comments and participate in the discussions in the comments section down below. And all these things are things that the YouTube algorithm looks at to decide which videos to recommend to new viewers. So you'll be helping us get recommended to new viewers, and that helps get the word out. And you can also do that by sharing this video with your friends, either by email, on your social media, on Facebook, in relevant Facebook groups, and in Twitter and other social media as well. All right, let's get going. As usual, we have handouts for this video so you can follow along, and you can download those handouts or a PDF file from a link in the video description. So the first page says the Peshitta as a revision of the Old Syriac. Now this is something we went over in the previous video on the Old Syriac in more detail, and I'll leave a link to that video in the video description on the Old Syriac. But the Peshitta is a revision of the Old Syriac. So it says this is quoting from Arthur Vebus, I believe is the way you pronounce his name, although it's spelled Vubus. I could be wrong, but I have heard that it's pronounced Vebus. And he wrote a book called Early Versions of the New Testament, Manuscript Studies. He was one of the leading, in fact, in the 20th century, he was probably the leading Syriac scholar, certainly one of the leading Syriac scholars of the 20th century. And he wrote that book in 1954, and on pages 97 through 98, he wrote, "The Peshitta is not a new translation, but a revision of the Old Syriac version. As the result of this revision, digressions were eliminated, additions removed, omissions supplemented, and peculiarities retouched. Through this process, the Peshitta lost its former singularities and variants, which were much cherished and so deeply rooted in Syriac textual traditions. After this process, the text assumed a wholly new complexion, conforming more or less to the Greek. This distinguishes the Peshitta from the Old Syriac. Its back is turned on the ancient and endearing traditions, and its face is decidedly turned towards the Greek form. Many idiomatic expressions found in the Old Syriac, particularly the conjunctive construction over against the use of the infinitive and the predilection towards the nominal sentence, have been modified and adopted more to the Greek, but much of the idiomatic phraseology was still retained." And then the handout says Kenyon says of this revision. That's a mistake. That's a holdover from the Old Syriac handouts that I modified here. It actually is another quote here from Arthur Vebus from page 103 of the same book. While older liturgical manuscripts show the influence of the Old Syriac, the revised manuscripts contain the text according to the Peshitta. And as we mentioned in the previous video, there's a Peshitta manuscript called Codex Philipps 1388. It's a 5th to 6th century manuscript of the four Gospels, and this particular manuscript has many Old Syriac readings, demonstrating that the Old Syriac and the Peshitta are part of the same Syriac textual scribal tradition, and that some Syriac manuscripts, including this one, actually retain some Old Syriac readings. And when we compare the two major manuscripts we have of the Old Syriac, we find that each of them sometimes departs from the other in agreement with the Peshitta. Okay, so they're all part of the same Syriac textual tradition. It's important to note that the Peshitta, by the way, only contains 22 New Testament books, not 27. The Peshitta text and the Peshitta canon lacks 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, Jude, and Revelation. Some Syriac manuscripts and some Syriac copies of the New Testament will include those other 5 books from later Syriac translations, but they're not actually from the Peshitta itself. Okay, also there is a Peshitta Old Testament, or a Peshitta Tanakh, and the Peshitta Tanakh includes the Apocrypha, by the way, and it's a literal it's a literal Aramaic translation from the Hebrew, which may be why it's called the Peshitta originally, because Peshitta can mean simple or literal, and the Aramaic Targums are paraphrased translations. The Peshitta Tanakh is actually even quoted in the Talmud on occasion, verbatim. Now, even though the Peshitta is a revision of the Old Syriac, and what the Old Syriac is a Western type text, there are 3 text types. The Western type text, the Alexandrian type text, and the later Byzantine type text. And I would argue that the Western type text is the most original, the oldest, because it is also the most Semitic, and it's one of the 2 oldest types. It is also the text type of the oldest other language versions, if you will. It is the oldest, it is the text type of the Old Latin and of the Old Syriac, which is why the Western text type used to be called the Syro-Latin text type. And it's also the text type, obviously, of the Western Greek text type of such manuscripts as Codex Bezae, also known as Codex D. So the Peshitta is modified or revised towards greater agreement with the later Byzantine type of Greek text. However, it's still very useful to us and very helpful to us because it is a revision of the Old Syriac, and we only have the 4 Gospels for the Old Syriac, and even then, of the 4 Gospels, we only have 95%. Because of missing pages between the 2 major manuscripts of the Old Syriac, neither of them is very complete, and when we bring them both together, we're still lacking 5% of the Gospels. So that 5% of text we can garner from the Peshitta, because the Peshitta is at least a revision of the Old Syriac. Also, the 2 manuscripts we have of the Old Syriac occasionally disagree with each other, oftentimes agreeing with the Peshitta, but sometimes not. And since the Peshitta is a revision of the Old Syriac, it may in fact at times, since we only have 2 Old Syriac manuscripts, and they don't always agree with each other, the Peshitta Gospels may at times preserve more original readings than have been, in other words, Old Syriac readings that have been lost and aren't preserved in either of the 2 Old Syriac manuscripts. Also, because we only have the 4 Gospels in the Old Syriac, the Gospels give us, the Peshitta gives us our only witness, effectively our only witness, to the Aramaic of the post-Gospels portion of the text. There is something called the CPA, or Christian Palestinian Aramaic, or Syro-Palestinian Aramaic, and but that's problematic. It's definitely revised to agree with the Greek as well, and it's it's not even clear. It has some relationship with the Old Syriac, but it's not clear how great it is. Okay, but the Peshitta gives us the only Aramaic then witness primarily, generally speaking, of the post-Gospels portion. Now, we do have other witnesses that point to the original Aramaic text of the post-Gospels portion. The Syriac church fathers, when they quoted the Gospels, they tended to agree with the Old Syriac, not the Peshitta. So we can conclude that that's probably going to be the case in the post-Gospels portion. So when we see the Syriac church fathers quote the post-Gospels, the emissaries, in Aramaic in ways that differ from the Peshitta, there may well be preserving Old Syriac readings. We can also then look at the Western type Greek text and the Western Old Latin text, and we can look at the underlying Aramaic behind those, especially in combination with the Peshitta, to get strong clues as to the original Aramaic reading, and the Peshitta is definitely a very important part of that process. There are also scribal errors, or places where the Peshitta seems to preserve original readings, where the Greek either misread an Aramaic word or was based on a manuscript that had a scribal error that's just one letter off from the Aramaic word that we see in the Peshitta, and where the Peshitta makes much more sense. There's several of these in the Gospels, but they're also found in the Old Syriac, so I just want to look at a couple. We may do a whole video on some of these later, but there's just a couple I'll look at here that are in the post-Gospels portion of the text that are unique to the Peshitta. First of all, and this is our next handout titled Scribal Errors. First of all, we have Romans 5:7, where the Greek says, "For scarcely does a man die for the righteous," which seems an odd reading because you would think that that wouldn't be too scarce. By comparison to what the Peshitta has, "For scarcely does a man die for the wicked." So the word wicked in the Peshitta is Resh, Shin, Ayin, Yud, Aleph. And it was probably misread by the Greek or miscopied by a scribe that fled to the Greek. Resh, Shin, Nun, Yud, Aleph for righteous. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 5, the Greek says, "Therefore do not defraud one another." And the much more likely reading is what we see in the Peshitta, "Therefore do not deprive one another." And if you look in your handout, you can see the Aramaic words right next to each other, and you can see that it's just one letter different. Okay, there are also ambiguous Aramaic phrases that are mistranslated in the Greek. Many of these are found in the Gospels portion and are also found in the Old Syriac. So I want to stick with just a couple of those, and we'll just look at a couple in Acts that are in the post-Gospels portion and unique to the Peshitta. So in Acts chapter 8, verse 27, we have the instance where Philip meets the Ethiopian eunuch on the road, and the Ethiopian eunuch has been studying Isaiah. He's on his way back to Ethiopia from Jerusalem, and where he had come to worship. Now, the word eunuch here is problematic, and that's because in Deuteronomy 23:1 forward, we find that eunuchs weren't allowed to become proselytes, and they weren't allowed to participate in temple worship. And this guy has apparently been participating in the pilgrimage to Jerusalem in Deuteronomy 16:16 for the feasts. So the issue here is that the word eunuch in Aramaic is mahemna, which can mean eunuch, but it also means believer or faithful one, which is clearly what it means here. Philip has met an Ethiopian believer on his way home from having worshipped at Jerusalem. The next one we'll look at is in Acts chapter 11, verses 27 through 30. And here it says, in reading from our traditional text, and in these days prophets came from Jerusalem to Antioch. Then one of them, named Agabus, stood up and showed by the Spirit that there was going to be a great famine throughout all the world, which also happened in the days of Claudius Caesar. So the question is, as the story goes, they take up a collection of food and they send it to Judea to help the brothers dwelling in Judea. Now, the problem with that is that if the famine is going to strike all the world, what benefit is there in redistributing food and sending it to Judea? That just means people are going to starve in Antioch. So why do that? What value is there in changing where people starve? The answer to this is that the phrase "the world," or the word for "world" in Aramaic in the Peshitta here is "era." Strong's 772. This is the Aramaic form of the Hebrew word "eretz," Strong 776, which is a word that can mean world, as in Proverbs 19:4, earth, as in Daniel 2:35, or land, as in Daniel 9:15, and it's often used as a euphemism for the land of Israel, as in Daniel 9:6. In fact, in Israel today, people will refer to Israel as Haaretz, the land. So it makes much more sense that this famine was going to strike Haaretz, the land meaning the land of Israel, and that the believers at Antioch sent food to Judea to help them with the famine that they were going to face. There are also many passages where the synoptic gospels have a variance between each other. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they read very much alike, but sometimes there will be just a little bit of a difference. Maybe it's just a word or a phrase. And there are many places where that word or phrase in the Aramaic of the Old Syriac and the Peshitta differs, is either a single ambiguous word that the Greek translated two different ways, or is a word that got miscopied or misunderstood, misread by, say, one letter or something by the Greek translator. Also, oftentimes when the Old Syriac and Peshitta quote from the Tanakh, their quote tends to agree with the Masoretic text and the Peshitta Tanakh against the Septuagint. This tendency is much greater, by the way, in the Old Syriac, but it still exists in the Peshitta. In fact, we did a video recently on the question of does the New Testament quote the Septuagint, and this is one of the things that we looked at, and I'll try and remember to put a link to that video here in the video description. The tendency of the Peshitta is to quote either the Peshitta Tanakh and or the Masoretic. I don't say the Masoretic text didn't exist yet, but the Hebrew text. There are also word plays, puns, and alliteration in the Peshitta text. We did a video recently on what language did Paul write in, and one of the things that we looked at, and I'll try and remember to put a link to that video too, but if not, you can go back and find it. We talked about in the book of Ephesians how Paul makes multiple word plays, and that you can tell when you actually look at the text that the word play that Paul is making is actually foundational to a pivot in the logic and reasoning of his argument, making it very clear. And this is we were then actually referencing what the Peshitta says. So here we have the Peshitta was actually it's very obvious by looking at the text that the Peshitta was the underlying original text, although there could have been a Hebrew even behind that, would have still worked, that was driving Paul's thought process. Another example, it's in Ephesians also, of a wordplay in the Peshitta Aramaic, is where Paul talks about, and he contrasts the armor of Elohim with the wiles of the devil. And the word for armor in Aramaic is zena, and the word for wiles is zinta. So this is again a word play in the Aramaic. So there's a lot of evidence to indicate that the Aramaic text that we find preserved in the Peshitta descends from the original Aramaic that was the work of the emissaries themselves. Although that Aramaic is better preserved in the Old Syriac, it's still preserved in a revised form in the Peshitta. It's also helpful, I find it helpful then, because Aramaic is a Jewish language like Hebrew. Aramaic is written in the same 22 Hebrew letters. It has many of the same three-letter verbal roots, and it has much of the same vocabulary, very similar languages. And so much so that parts of the Tanakh are written in Aramaic. The book of Daniel starts out in Hebrew, and then it goes into Aramaic, and then it goes back into Hebrew with just seamlessly, just does it. Aramaic is also the language of the Targums, the Talmuds, and the Zohar. And speaking of the Targums, I think I may have mentioned, I hope I may repeat myself here, the Peshitta New Testament only contains 22 books. It doesn't include 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, or Jude or Revelation. It's lacking those 5 books. It does contain also, there is a Peshitta Tanakh, and the Tanakh portion of the Peshitta is a literal translation of the Hebrew of the Tanakh. It's not translated from the Septuagint. It's very clear by looking at it. And it's a literal translation, and it may be called Peshitta because it was a literal translation of the Tanakh, whereas the Targums were very paraphrased Aramaic translations of the Tanakh. Also, it bears mentioning that the Peshitta version of the Tanakh includes the Apocrypha with the exception of 1st Esdras. Now, I find it helpful to look at Aramaic words that appear in the Peshitta and in the Old Syriac, and see how those same Aramaic words are used in the Targums, the Talmuds, and the Zohar to help open the door, in many cases, to a Jewish understanding of the books of the New Testament. And the Peshitta then plays a very important part in that process. And the Peshitta plays a very important part in the process of reaching to and getting and understanding the Hebrew and Aramaic origin of the New Testament, and getting a Jewish understanding of those books as well. Okay, to wrap up here, I just need to ask everybody to please consider donating to support these videos and this work. For those that don't know, my wife is disabled. She's chronically ill and she suffers chronic pain, and I am her caretaker. So we could definitely use your help. You can donate by clicking on the donate link in the video description, or sending donations by PayPal to donations@wnae.org. You can also please help us out by liking this video, by subscribing to this channel, by clicking that notification bell so you'll get notified when new videos come out. letting us know what you think in the comments and participating in the discussions in the comments section, because the YouTube algorithm looks at all those things to decide which videos to recommend to new viewers. And you can also help us get recommended to new viewers, or recommend us to new viewers yourself, by sharing these videos in email with your friends, or on social media, on Facebook, and in Facebook groups where it's relevant, and Twitter and other social media that you may participate in. All right, until next time, everybody, shalom.